Today we're going to continue our series on Habakkuk. Now, how many of you say Habakkuk? How many of you say Habakkuk? I don't know. You say what you want. But today we're going to find out that God's going to answer Habakkuk's prayer. Remember last week he prayed and he asked God for some things. Today God's going to answer his prayer, but it's not going to be quite like he thought it should be. Have you ever had prayer answered that way? Not quite like what you thought it should be. And have you ever gone to a restaurant and not gotten what you thought you should have gotten? How many times? Ever had that? Yeah. In fact, if you haven't had that experience, go have lunch today right after church. You'll probably have it today. It doesn't quite come the way you think it should come. I remember when I was working at the car dealership, we would on Saturdays the dealership would buy us lunch. And that was one of the incentives to work on Saturday, is that you're going to get a free lunch. And so what we would do is we would all get together, we'd kind of select where we want to eat. And we would get online then, and we would make an online order. Now, how hard is that? How hard is it just to go down the list and select the items you want on a burrito? Not hard. Well, you want steak, you want cheese, you want whole beans, you want refried, whatever you want. You just check the little boxes on the thing. But it was amazing to me the number of times we would go, and then I would go pick it up and I'd bring it back, and numerous guys would say, "This is not what I ordered." Really? So what I started doing was I would make a copy of what they ordered. And I'd go, "What did you think you ordered?" And they'd say, "Well, I thought I ordered blah, 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 and I didn't want this, and I wanted this." And I said, take a look. All you have to do is check off the check boxes. Look what you checked. Exactly what you got. But it just doesn't come quite like we thought it should. And sometimes our prayer doesn't get answered quite like we thought it should. And that's what Habakkuk is experiencing here. Remember, he prayed and he asked God, he complained about three things. First of all, he said, "God, why don't you hear me when I pray?" Now, he equated hearing with acting. If God heard, then he would act, right? I run into the same problem at home. Cindy says, "Take out the trash," and what do? I jump right up and take out the trash. Sometimes, but not often. And I'm glad she sits in the back where you can't see her going, "You don't do that." And so I'm watching sports on TV. And guys are singularly focused, right? And we can only do one thing at a time. I could hear her, I heard her, but I didn't respond. So a little while later she says, "Did you hear me?" Yeah, I heard her, didn't I? In a fashion. But she equates, if you heard me, you would do it. And that's what Habakkuk does. And most of us are the same way. We think if somebody hears us, then they will take what we said and they'll act on it. Well, that's what Habakkuk thought God should do. But he complained. He says, "God, why is it that you don't hear me when I pray?" Because he thought God should take action. The second thing that he said was, "Why, God, does evil prevail? Why is it that there's evil in this world and you don't do anything about it? After all, God, isn't that your job to do stuff about evil?" That was his idea. That's what God should do, is take care of evil. And the third thing he said was, "Why is there no justice?" It seems like the evil people are getting bonuses. They're getting ahead in life. And the good people, the righteous people, they're not getting ahead in life. And we talked about that last week. Crime does pay, right? It really does. Sometimes, I'm not suggesting you start a life of crime, but sometimes crime pays, and we look at that and we say, why is it that criminals get ahead? Well, hopefully they don't for long, and I'm not suggesting you take that lifestyle, but now we're coming to a point in Habakkuk where God's going to answer Habakkuk's prayer. In chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, here's what he says. He says this, and this is God speaking here. He says, "Look among the nations and see." Now, he's saying that if you look, you'll see, right? He says, "Look and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. Now, what did Habakkuk ask for? He says, God, remember, just hear my prayer. Take care of the violence in the land and let justice prevail. Those are good prayers, aren't they? They're the prayers probably on the voice of every Christian person in the world. God, do those three things. Hear my prayer, answer my prayer, make sure that evil does not prevail, and make sure there's justice in the land. Good prayers, right? Now, what does God answer with? God is going to answer with one word, and I'm going to call that, the way that he answers, I'm going to call that not violence, but judgment. He's going to answer with judgment. God agrees with Habakkuk, right? He says, I do need to hear your prayer. I do need to answer your prayer. I do sense that there is violence in this land. I do sense that there is no justice in this land. Evil is prevailing. I'm going to do something about it. Now, notice he's going to bring judgment upon the land. So, before we get to that point, let's take a look at some of the things that are obvious in the scripture. The first thing is that God's sovereignty over history should astound us. Now, we've made a proclamation here. I'm on the right slide. It's good to know. Okay, God's sovereignty over history. Now, sovereignty. Let's discuss sovereignty for a moment. Sovereignty means what? Okay, number one, it means that God can do anything he wants, anytime he wants, however he wants. Okay, God can do whatever he wants, anytime he wants, however he wants. Because God made this land, right? God made the earth. It's his. And he can do with it whatever he wants. Now, it's kind of an arrogant posture for us to say, God, here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. I think that there's evil in the land, so you should do something about the evil. Well, maybe that evil is for our benefit and not our harm. Maybe it's for our judgment so that we can get right with God, so that we can start adhering to what he says is true and accurate and avoid the pitfalls of arrogance. So first of all, God's sovereignty over the whole world should astound us. Now, in Habakkuk 1:5, here's what God says. He says, look among the nations and see. Look and see. Look and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days. Circle that word, your. That you would not believe if told. Now, those words are plurals. Now, in our English language, I could say you singularly, and I can say you plurally, can't I? In the Hebrew language, this word is attached to all of those verbs that are in the verses. So if you read through that, you would say, you look, you plurally look, and you plurally see, you plurally wonder, and you plurally be astounded. All of us should take care of all of those things. First of all, he says, look. Look. Now, you can look and not see, can't you? Okay, you can look and you can say, okay, and you can describe what you looked at. But see, the word see means to look with understanding. Be able to understand what you see. And we look at the world around us, and we're going to look at world events today, and we're going to look, do we understand them? Not so much. Not so much. Because how do we look at them? We look at them through our selfish set of eyes, and we want the conclusion of those world events to be most beneficial to us. Okay, and to my comfort. Well, we're going to see that that's probably not the case. Now, Habakkuk here is told, you look and your nation look. Look at the nations and see. Understand what's going around in your world. Wonder. Okay, that word wonder is really an interesting word because it means to be wowed by what you see. Be wowed by what God is doing. Even though you may say, well, there's evil in the land, there's injustice in the land, God still says, be wowed by that. And then finally, be astounded. Be astounded. Now, God here presents the big picture because what does he say to look at? He says, look at the nations. What does Habakkuk really want? He wants his own little corner of the world to be taken care of. His own little piece of the pie, his own little sphere of influence. He says, Lord, if you could just make my situation comfortable, and if you could make my little piece of the pie here livable, I'd be really happy with that. But God says, oh no, you have to look beyond that. Look at the nations around you. And so God says, take a look at the big picture. Habakkuk hoped for answers, and his answer was intervention and rescue. That's what he wanted. He wanted God to intervene in his situation, and he wanted him to rescue him from that. But what did God answer with? He answered with judgment. He says, oh man, this is bigger than what you think. And the answer to your prayer is going to be larger than what you can even imagine. Now, Habakkuk had kind of insinuated that God was not at work. You know, God, why do I pray and you don't answer? Why do I pray and you do nothing is really what he's implying. But God responds with what? That he is at work. Notice what he says here. You would not believe it, for I am doing a what? A work in your days that you would not believe if told. In other words, there's something going on here, Habakkuk, that you don't see. Now, do you think there's stuff going on in our world that we don't see? Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why I think Habakkuk's message to the people of his time is so poignant to us today. Because we believe that in fact, I believe that we're kind of like deists. You know what a deist is? A deist is a person that believes that there is a God. He created everything that we know. He spun the world on its axis and kind of floated it out there in space and has nothing to do with it now. Okay, he's not involved personally with the world, but at some point in time, he's going to come back. That's what a deist is. Now, they don't believe that God is intimately involved on a daily and regular basis in his creation, in his people's lives. Now, I believe that a lot of Christians really kind of think like deists. And they think, well, God's really not here. And in fact, Habakkuk kind of reveals that himself. God, why aren't you doing anything? You know, you're not active in the world around us. And God says, oh, I'm doing something. And you would be amazed. You'd be utterly astounded if you could see it. If you could see it. So he says, look and see. Look at the nations around you and notice what I am doing. Now, there's a problem that we have with prophecy. Have you ever noticed that? And what Habakkuk is delivering to his people is a thing called prophecy. It's what God is going to do in his world. Okay, I'm telling you, I pray to God, and then I'm going to hear from God, and then I'm going to tell you what God says. That's what prophecy is all about. So Habakkuk is praying to God. God has now answered him, and God wants him to declare those things to the people of his world. Now, here's the problems that we have with prophecy. Number one, most of us are nationalistic. You know, aren't we? We bleed red, white, and blue, don't we? You know, and if you're a Dodger fan, you just bleed blue. But red, white, and blue, you know, we believe in the American way. In fact, today, you know, you'll see flags out. You know, we're waving the red, white, and blue. And we're so nationalistic that we're kind of like Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk was very nationalistic himself. He believed that his little piece of the pie there in Judea, he said, God, if you just take care of us, everything would be wonderful. Well, would it? No, there's a whole entire world around Judea that God is not involved in. You know, that Habakkuk didn't care if he did anything with. And so we're kind of that same way. We're nationalistic. We want God to take care of what? The good old US of A, huh? If God took care of the US of A, everything would be right in the world. Well, there's a couple of problems with that I have. And one of the major problems is that the Bible is 30% prophecy about what God is going to do in his world. Okay, in his creation. 30% of the Bible includes prophecy about this world. Now, nowhere in that 30% of prophecy have I read anything about the United States of America being integral in God's plan for the redemption of his world. Now, don't misunderstand me. God is vitally involved in the US of A in helping us to see people come to know him. Okay, that's vital, that's important. I'm not saying that. But in the big scheme of things, as nations interact with nations, I do not see the United States of America being a major player in those events in the Bible prophecy. Now, who's the number one nation in the world? Islam. Who said Islam? Okay, you're right, but that's the number one religion in the world. But we think that the United States is the most powerful nation in the world, don't we? And so therefore the United States of America should have the most to do with how the world turns out. But when we look at prophecy, we don't see the United States of America really being talked about in specific terms. So most of us are nationalistic. That's why we have this problem with prophecy. That's why we have problems seeing if Habakkuk were here today and he says, okay, you guys here at Marina Church, I want you to look at the nations around you. The first nation we would look at is the United States of America, because we believe that we are the most powerful, we are the most influential, we're the most economically sound nation in the world. But God says, oh no, look beyond that. Look at the nations of the world. The second problem that we have with prophecy is that most of us are apathetic about the rest of the world. Did you know that today, how many deaths do you think there's going to be today in the entire world? Take a shot. Anybody? Come on, help me. 150,000 deaths today in a 24-hour span of time. How many of those are we concerned about? We're not really, unless it's somebody in our family, or somebody that's close to us, somebody that we personally know. But there will be 150,000 people die today. That's tragic. And I think that should move us a little bit. But most of us are let's be honest, we're pretty much apathetic about the things that don't influence that close core of people around us, and specifically, if we get beyond that, the nation in which we live. And so when it comes to this Bible prophecy of God saying, look beyond the United States of America, look at the nations of the world, we just go, well, yeah, okay, maybe. Well, my goal today is for us to correct our thinking. Okay, let's correct the way that we think. Now, the Bible declares that God started history, He sustains history, and He's going to end history. Okay? That's what the Bible declares. That God started history at creation, when He created the heavens and the earth, populated it with animals, created the stars and all of that stuff prior to that, and then created the animals, created human beings to populate the earth, and He started history. He started history as we know it. Now, the second thing that He does is He sustains history. God is active every day in this world. And if you go back to chapter 1, verse 5, He says, For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. God is doing a work today in our nation and the nations around us in order for His perfect plan to come to completion. He is the God of history. He is active today. He is sustaining history. He's creating history. Okay. Finally, He is going to conclude history. When Jesus comes back in judgment, when Jesus comes back to this earth in judgment, that will be the culmination of history as this world knows it. Then history will go on from that point, but it will be a heavenly history at that point. And so therefore, history as we know it on this world is going to come to a conclusion when Christ returns. Now, so let's kind of correct our thinking. There's a passage of scripture here found in Isaiah chapter 56, verses 9 through 11. There we go. And it says this, remember the former things of old. And this is Isaiah, another prophet in the Old Testament, talking about remember the former things of old. And when he was delivering this to the people, he was saying, I want you to remember what God has done in times past. Number one, I want you to remember God creating the heavens and the earth. I want you to remember God taking care of all of that stuff. I want you to remember God planting this nation of Israel. I want you to remember God delivering this nation of Israel. I want you to remember all of that stuff. And he goes on. He says, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. Okay, he is the God of history. And from ancient times, things not yet done. Okay, he says, I declared those things that have happened before, and I will declare things that will happen in the future. I am the God of history. Okay, he says this, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east and the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it. God has already written history down. He is now in the process of accomplishing it. And we're going to find out that God uses some strange creatures, some strange beings, some strange people in order to accomplish His history. Okay, let's correct our thinking. So the first thing I want us to correct is that God wants everyone to get the message. God wants everyone to get the message. Okay? He says, look. He says, look. He's saying, open your eyes and see what's going on in the world around you. He says, see. He wants you to contemplate, and so that you can gain understanding. Look, observe, and then see and understand. Now, he also says, I want you to wonder. I want you to wonder. I want you to be stunned. I want you to be dumbfounded. I want you to go, oh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that. Because most of us are looking too close. We're looking too close around us to really see what God is doing, because he's doing it in the nations around us. He what says, I want you to be astounded, dazzled, and amazed. And when you stop and think, the first three things are the things that we should be doing. We should see, we should look, we should see, we should be in wonder. And the result of those three things is, whoa, I'm astounded by what God's doing. Wow. Now, if you're not wowed by what God is doing, then you're not doing the first three things. You're not looking at the nations around. You're not looking with understanding, and you're not wondering about what's going on. So, if you want to change the way you see the world around you, do those first three things. Look at the nations around you. Okay, see, look with understanding, see how things fit together, see what things are going on, and look at it from God's perspective, and then you will wonder about that, and you'll be astounded when you finally see. Now, there's another thing that I want us to see, and if you want people to get the message, we need to understand some things about the message. The first thing to understand about the message is that God's plan is right on schedule. Oh, I'm sorry. There I am. God's plan is right on schedule. Have you ever thought that, boy, if I was God, I would do things differently? I'd do them quicker. I would do them maybe more efficiently. I would have a much shorter time span to get things done. Have you ever done that? I'll be honest, I've done that. I thought, if I was God, here's what I would do. And as soon as I do that, I remember, you know what? God has a plan. He's executing his plan, and it's right on schedule. Now, in the New Testament, we find some interesting passages. And one of those passages is found in Galatians 4:4-5. It says this, but when the fullness of time had come. Now, if you want to circle that phrase, I already underlined it there for you. When the fullness of time had come, what it means is just at the right time. Now, what is the right time? The right time is when God has set up everything he needs to set up in order to execute his plan. Have you ever pulled off a plan prior to setting it up? You'd say, oh man, I could do this, this, and this. Okay, I'm going to do it. But you didn't set it up. You didn't get the right help. You didn't have the right circumstances. You didn't have the right weather conditions. You didn't have the right resourcing. You didn't have the right financing. You didn't have the right stuff. Well, God has all of his resources in place, and he says this in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4-5 this way. But when the fullness of time had come, when everything was set up, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive redemption as sons. When the right time came. If you were writing history, wouldn't you say, okay, let's do creation. Okay, we'll do creation, because that's a big part of the story. Let's do creation. And then, okay, well, we need to show mankind's need. So let's let Adam and Eve mess up in the garden. Let's let them sin. And then right after that, I would have sent Jesus. Wouldn't that make sense? Mess up in the garden. Am I on the right thing? Oh, yeah. Adoption as sons. Okay, where we are written. I'm glad that you asked that, Charlotte. Thank you. See, always be bold, be courageous, and ask questions when it says something. Okay, adoption as sons, and I'm going to say as daughters too, because you're a lady asking that. Yeah, okay, but adoption. Okay, because when we are we born part of God's family? No. We're born aliens from God's family, right? Because we are born in sin. Okay, we're born in sin, so we're estranged from God, and God adopts us as sons and daughters. Now, what would you rather be, a natural born child or an adopted child? Good question, huh? Because we all want to say, I would rather be a natural born child, right? that doesn't really work with God because we'd have to be born perfectly. But we're born separated from God because of our sinfulness. I remember when I was growing up, and I've told you this story before, my sister, she used to, sometimes I would embarrass her because she's my older sister, and now she's my much older sister. But when we were growing up, she would say, I would embarrass her in front of her friends or whatever. She said, "Oh, you're adopted. You're adopted." And that would hurt my feelings. And it hurt my feelings. And so, being the crafty young man that I was, I finally decided, well, you know what? Okay, I'm going to find a way to get back at her for that. So the next time she said, "Oh, you're just adopted." I said, "Yeah, I know. Mom and Dad chose me. They had to have you." Now, that's kind of a mean thing to say to your sister. And so if you're here today and you have younger siblings, don't ever do that. Disclaimer there. But the truth of the matter is what would you rather be? A had-to-have child that was maybe not loved, or one that was chosen? And that's why I like the adoption thing, because God chose us to be his children. Okay, now we have to cooperate with that in order to become his children, right? We have to kind of sign on the adoption papers. But the truth of the matter is that he chooses us. He chooses us. So we're adopted because we're originally born estranged from God because of our sinfulness. And then he sends his son Jesus to die. And that's what this whole passage of Scripture is about. Here, if I can find it. It says here, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons and daughters. Okay, he paid the price for the forgiveness of our sins so that we could be adopted, become part of the family. Because without forgiveness of sin, you're not part of the family. Okay, make sense? I don't want to miss that point. Go ahead, Charlotte.
I just got a little confused because you had used the word redemption in the phrase.
Oh, really? So what you're saying is that I misread that. Thank you, Charlotte. Anybody else recognize that? Okay, thank you. Okay. I'll be giving it up now to Charlotte. Charlotte will finish up the message this morning, and we'll get things right. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Adoption, not redemption. It kind of looks the same to me, though, without glasses. Okay, now, so there. I got to find out what we're talking about. Okay, God's plan is right on schedule. Can we all agree to that? Yes, God's plan is right on schedule. Okay, another thing that we need to kind of help with our rethinking is that God gives revelation, not explanation. Have you ever wanted God to explain stuff? We're kind of the ultimate 3-year-old. And somebody says something to us and says, "Do this." And what's our first question? Why? Because I said so. Why? Well, because I'm your parent. Why? Well, because you were born to me. Why? And we don't respond well to direction unless we know why. And God doesn't give us the why all the time, does he? He gives revelation, not explanation. We want those questions answered. Now, why does God not provide explanation, do you think? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think. Number one, we couldn't understand it. If God were to explain to us what he's doing in the big scheme of the world, we would not be able to understand it. And if we could understand it, that would mean we're as smart as God. I understand everything God said. And wouldn't that be putting you on an equal footing with God? Well, God's ways are far greater than our ways. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And so therefore, he is far above understanding than we are. So for him to explain everything to us, we would not be able to understand it because we are not God. We are limited in our human comprehension. In John chapter 16, oh no, it's not on there. Never mind. In John chapter 16, verse 12, Jesus says this. He says this to his disciples. He says, "I have many more things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. You couldn't understand them if I told you." And you would just get so confused, and you would spend all of your time trying to figure out the explanation, and you would never be doing the doing part. Okay? God wants us to do what he has revealed, not understand everything that he has not explained to us. Okay? Now there's another thing here. Another reason why he does that. And, here we go. There we go. Okay, we wouldn't believe it even if he told it to us. And he says that right here in verse number 5. He says this. He says, I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. I could tell you what I'm doing, but you wouldn't believe it. You'd just say, I can't believe that. I can't believe it. And when we don't believe it, what is that? Not believing is the antithesis of faith. Peter has an experience like this with Jesus. Jesus says, you know what? I'm going to die and I'm going to go to the cross. And this is in the New Testament. And he says this in Matthew 16. he says to Peter, he says, oh yeah, I'm going to die. I'm going to a cross. I'm going to die for the sins of mankind and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to, 3 days later, I'm going to be raised. And what does Peter say when he tells him that? Oh, no, you're not. Not while I'm around, because when I'm on the job, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to guard you. I'm going to stay right beside you. And nothing bad's ever going to happen to you, Jesus. Trust me on this one. Well, he doesn't say it exactly like that, but he does say something to that effect. And what does Jesus say? This is exactly what Jesus said. He says, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Jesus said, oh, no, you don't see the big picture. The big picture is for me to die. Because if I don't die, mankind does not receive redemption. Mankind does not receive forgiveness of sin. Mankind will still squalor in death. Still spend his time in sinfulness. And he says, that's not what I want. So therefore, dude, Peter, thanks. I appreciate the sentiment, but don't do that. Get behind me, Satan. Okay? So he doesn't understand it. Now, explanations do not encourage faith, do they? If I could explain everything there is to know about the Bible, would you trust it more? Probably not. Probably not. In fact, it would cause you to question it more. Now, what causes us to have faith is fulfilled promises of God. When God says something and he does it, then I say, I trust that guy. Okay? Now, when you have your human relationships around you, what do? You evaluate them, don't you? And there are some relationships that are trustworthy, some that are not. Because there's always two evaluators. One is, what do they say? What do they say? And the second one is the bigger one. What do they do? Does what they do match up with what they say? I can trust that. When the saying and the doing don't match up, I can't trust the saying, can I? Okay, when they say stuff, I hope so, but I just don't know. I don't think so, because I don't see a track record of faithfulness. And so, therefore, this whole idea of faith is built on God keeping his promises, not God explaining everything to us. So I think that's an important thing, and it should change the way we think. Now, there's another thing here. God's tools of judgment shock us. God's tools of judgment shock us. Now, I could tell, last week we talked about the reasons I think 9/11 happened, and I could see on the looks of some people's faces where they said, really? I don't think so. Because I said that I think 9/11 happened when the Twin Towers were crashed into, when the Pentagon was crashed into, and when the flight went down, and I believe the third flight that went down, I do believe that it was headed for our capital. And so therefore, there were 3 areas that God brought judgment. People said, where's God in all this? Why didn't God? And we had this idea that God should do what? Protect us. After all, we're the United States of America. We're not declared anywhere in the Bible prophecy, but God should do it because we are living here. And God should do it because we're living here. And so therefore, absolutely, we're special. And so therefore, when God brought that whole thing, we think that God must have been asleep. Somebody must have circumvented really what God wanted. But I believe that God wanted those things to happen to us. Okay, number 1, they attacked the Twin Towers, and that was the representation of our financial wealth, our financial dependence. And God said, don't trust your money. Don't trust your money to get you out of whatever it is that you're in. He says, number 2, and the other plane crashed into the Pentagon. He says, don't trust your military power. Don't trust that, because I can use whatever military power I want to bring judgment on whoever I want. And the third plane, I think, was headed for our capital. He says, don't trust, not that we should distrust our government, but don't trust your government greater than what you trust me. Okay? Don't trust that. Don't trust that. And I'm saying, and hear me say this. I think I would live in the United States of America before anywhere else in the world. I would do that. I love the United States of America. Don't get me wrong. But when it comes to the United States of America versus God, I'm on God's side. Okay, I'm on God's side. And I think he brings judgment to us so that we can change our ways. That's what judgment is all about. So that we can change our ways, change what we trust and depend upon. And last week when I said I think that God used that in the history of the United States of America to bring judgment on, I could see some people go, But we would be amazed, or shocked rather, with God's tools of judgment. Now, ultimately, we have to acquiesce to the fact that God is sovereign, right? God can do whatever he wants, however he wants, with whomever he wants. And so therefore, if we have that, we have to understand a couple of other things. God's sovereignty reminds us of two things. Number one, God's purpose is bigger than ours. Okay? God's purpose is bigger than ours. You know, if your purpose in life, you know, when you stop and calculate that and maybe even write that down, what's my purpose in life? My purpose in life is to take care of my family, make sure that my kids have food, education, blah, blah, blah. My job is to make sure that I bring home the bacon. My job is to make sure that Cindy fries it up in a pan. My job is to make sure whatever, you know, to do all of those things. It's really a pretty small circle, isn't it? Our purpose in life. God's plan is for the entire world, the entire universe, the entire span of history. God's plan is bigger than our plan. The second thing that we have to understand is God's plan includes everyone. God's plan includes everyone. And not only does God's plan include everyone, but God's plan can use everyone. God, remember when Balaam was going and he was going to make a prophecy for the king of the time, and his donkey wouldn't go, you know, his donkey wouldn't go down the road because there was an angel that Balaam couldn't see standing in the road. His donkey could see the angel, and Balaam gets off the donkey, you know, kicks the donkey and whips the donkey and does all this stuff to get the donkey to move because the donkey won't go. And what does God do? God speaks through the donkey. He says, Balaam, haven't I been good to you all my life? Whoa, when your donkey says that to you, you gotta understand that there is a God. There is a God out there. And God is a pretty miraculous God. And God can use anything he wants. Now, God can use a donkey. He can probably use us, right? To accomplish his purpose. Now, God can also use any nation in the world that he wants to use. It doesn't have to be a godly nation. Sometimes we get this thought in our head that God will only use those things that are submitted to him. Okay? Like if God will use me if I just let God use me, you know, and I submit myself to him. God will use everyone he wants, however he wants. Now, I want you to notice that in the span of history that we're talking about, or in the period of history that we're talking about, here, he uses three nations. The three nations, the most powerful nations of the world at this time, are the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. Okay? None of those nations are Judah or Israel. Okay, the children of God. None of them are that. Okay, they're all pagan nations. And God will use them to bring judgment on his people, Judah. And that's the ones we're talking about here. He's already done it with Israel, but he's going to do it with Judah. All of these people, these pagan foreign guys, and notice he's described them here. And let's go back to the first page there of your outline. And notice how he describes the people he's going to use. He says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. Okay, the Chaldeans. I'm going to raise up the Assyrians. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. Ultimately, he raises up Egypt as well. He says, but I'm going to raise up these pagan Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation. How does he describe them? Bitter and hasty. They run off, you know, they're bitter people, they're ugly people, and they're hasty. They don't think things through. I'm going to use them, for behold, I'm raising them up, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Okay? They're going to take this stuff. They're going to take stuff that's not theirs. They're evil people. I'm going to use them, though. They're dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their justice goes forth. They get what they want. It's not justice in the sense of God. It's justice in the sense of what they want, because it goes forth from themselves. He says, that's the kind of people that I'm raising up and I'm going to use. Their horsemen press on proudly. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. In other words, they don't hide the violence that they're going to perpetrate on this nation of Judah. Okay, they're going to come. They're going to be violent. I'm telling you, I'm going to use them. Now, does that sound like the kind of people God should use? God should use us meek and lowly people, us gentle and humble folk, huh? Well, God says, I'll use whoever I want to accomplish whatever I want. I'll use the Chaldeans, I'll use the Assyrians, I'll use the Babylonians to accomplish what I want. Would God use the Muslims? Yes, he would. And that's what we have to get through our thick skulls sometimes, is that God will use whoever he wants because God's plan is right on schedule. God gives revelation, not explanation, okay? And God's tools of judgment should shock us, okay? God's plans are purpose is bigger. His plan includes everyone. And so therefore, here we go. The Babylonians, I don't want to go that far yet. Yes, I want to go right there. Okay, Babylonians. Prior to them decimating Assyria, you know who they were? You know, when you think of world powers, you think of people that have spanned a long period of time. But the Babylonians, they were in power for about 70 years. 70 years. They were a people that were not really a people. They lived kind of along the river, and they were just kind of loosely connected. And all of a sudden, a leader rises up among the Babylonians and organizes them. And they go to battle against the Assyrians and take out the Assyrians. They go to battle against the Egyptians as well. But in this 70-year span of time, they overtake the nation of Judah, the people of Israel. Okay, the Israelites, the Judahites actually, and he takes God's people because they occupy this central piece of land here between Egypt and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and so this property here is very valuable to them, and so it's strategic, and so they want to take that. 70-year period of time, they were the world power. Now that doesn't seem like a very long span of time, does it? But God will raise up people that he needs in order to use them however he wants to, in order to purify his people. Now remember, what's judgment for? Because he's judging his own people here, right? The people of Judah. He's judging them. Why does he want to judge them? The reason is not to punish. Judgment is not for the reason of punishment unless it's the final judgment. But God uses judgment in order to purify his people. He wants us to think right. He wants us to recognize him properly. He wants us to be able to repent from our ways of depending on other stuff and come to depend upon him. Okay, here we go. Okay, now, God's hatred, the third thing that we want to discuss today too, so that we get a proper view, is that God's hatred of self-sufficiency surprises us. God hates self-sufficiency. How many of you have read in the Bible, God helps those who help themselves? You know? You ever read that? No, you haven't. You've heard it. But that's not in the Bible. God helps those who help themselves is not in the Bible. You know, but we do that all the time, don't we? God helps those who help themselves. You know who God helps? God helps the helpless. Yes. You know, that's who he needs to help. God helps the people who are helpless. And so therefore, the more we can declare our helplessness, the more God says, oh, I need to help that poor Mike down there. That dude is helpless. He needs somebody to help him out. And God abhors the things that cause us to be prideful. In verse number 11, he says this, in Habakkuk 1:11, he says, then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. They say, I am so strong, I did all of this. Now it's interesting, if you read through the entire Old Testament, you're going to find that God uses the Assyrians, God uses the Babylonians, and then he punishes them for what they did. Does that make sense to anybody? You know why he punished them? Not for overcoming their enemies, not for taking possession of lands. He punished them because of their self-sufficiency. They were proud and they were arrogant, and they said, we did this. We did this. Now, I think that the Assyrians and the Babylonians had said, you know, God did this. God used us to do this. And we humbly bow before him. He would have rewarded them. He would not have punished them. But they said, we are proud, we are arrogant. Nobody can come up against the mighty nation of Babylon. Nobody can come up against the mighty nation of Assyria. Nobody can overcome us. And therefore, it wasn't God that did this. It was our might, our strength, our will, our power. And God says, I'll bring judgment on that. Okay, pride and self-sufficiency were the downfall of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. In Proverbs 16:18, we read these words. It says, pride goes before destruction. Pride goes before destruction. When we become proud and we become arrogant, what happens? We get destroyed because we do not have the power to sustain whatever it is we're prideful and arrogant about. So pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Okay, that never works. In 1969, Hurricane Camille was getting ready to come up the Gulf Coast there. In fact, it was going to hit a place called Pass Christian. P-A-S-S Christian, not past Christian, but past Christian. And in this little town, it was full of go-go bars and all kinds of evil and vile stuff. But on the coast, right there, 250 yards back from the ocean, there was this Richelieu Apartments. And it was some well-appointed apartments. Some wealthy people lived there. And the police chief came down and warned them because there were some guys out there, and what they held was a hurricane party. A hurricane party. They were on the third floor, or on the second floor of a third-story apartment building. And when the police chief came out, these guys came out on the balcony, and he says, "Hey, you guys, you got to get out of here because Hurricane Camille is coming, and it's coming right here. The full force of this thing is going to come right here." And they said, "Oh no, we're not leaving our property. We own this place." And he says, "No, you don't understand." I mean, he begged them to leave, to go find a safer place. He begged them and said, "No, we're having a hurricane party. Sorry, you go." And so what he did was, before he left, he asked for everybody's next of kin. And he made a list. Phone numbers and everything. And he says, "Okay, well, I can't force you to leave. It's, you're not breaking the law. It's not good sense, but I can't do anything about it." So he left. Sure enough, Hurricane Camille came right there. Boom. And it was 205-mile-an-hour winds, 28-foot high waves, and it decimated this 3-story apartment building. There was only one person who survived, and it was a little 5-year-old kid was found 2 days later clinging to a mattress. 5-year-old kid. That's all that was left of this entire town. Now, the point is what? The point is, when somebody comes and delivers a warning to you, heed it. Heed it. Habakkuk has delivered a warning to us today. He says, look at the nations around you. Make sure that you see and that you understand and you see what God is doing, and take that into account so that you can live a life that is in harmony with what God is doing. Okay? That's my message to you today. You've been warned. We've been warned. Let's take it to heart and let's do something about it.